Hello everyone, this is Addicron Podfic, back with another podfic. Today I will be doing I'll Be Home with Frayed Feathers by Fiction for Life _NZ. This will be, I can't even remember what part we're on anymore. But this will be chapters 21 and 22. We will start with chapter 21, obviously, Love in Paradise, and there is a disclaimer for this one for minor references to self-harm, allusions to an idolation of suicide, and is all around a little bit heavier because it is, Love in Paradise, and has Calypso. So, just warning for Calypso. Warning for Calypso, because Calypso is gonna be Calypso. I hate Calypso. I think that's quite obvious by my little rant here. Anyway, let's get right into it. Calypso never liked it when Odysseus went near the cliffs, when he would stand at the end and look down at the crashing waves below, or sit with his legs dangling over the edge as he stared at the sky. She would call him, urge him to move away and return to the safety of her home. Sometimes he would listen, other times she would have to pull him away with vines or her own hands, terrified that today might finally be the day he took it one step further and pitched himself into the sea. He was yet to do such a thing, but it felt like every time he was just a little bit closer, a little less hopeful that he'd ever get off of Aegigia. When he first washed up on the island, he could scarcely believe he was still alive, or that the island's sole inhabitant would be willing to bring him back from the brink of death. He'd been bedridden for days after he woke up, relying on her for everything as he gradually regained his strength. It was once he was able to move around by himself that things went wrong. Her gentle touches and soothing voice, which had nursed him back to health, soon became shackles he could not break free from. She called him hers, and only hers, treated him like a pet, a mortal she could coddle and love with no care for how he felt, an exotic accessory to add to her life. After all, how many would be able to proudly say that they had a husband with wings? "I'm not your man," he insisted, pushing her away when she'd first started to make advances. "I have a wife." She told him she was everything he wanted and needed. She was his paradise he had been so lucky to find. "I could kill you," he threatened when she started to hold him like they were lovers. "I'm no pet, not for a goddess. I'm married." She laughed and said he couldn't kill a god, that she should be kissing the ground beneath her feet and worshipping her for all she was, that he was lucky she loved him so much, to not expect his immediate devotion or acceptance. She was convinced in time he would return her obsessive feelings, even if it took years. Well, it had been years, and had yet to crack, and forget his beloved Penelope and growing son. He'd stopped counting after the first two, and at some point after that he'd molted, and, as he had been told by Hermes, he was even more miserable in the weeks that it took for his old feathers to fall out so that the new ones could grow in. It worked in sections, he quickly learned, and for all of the time he would stare at himself and the mirror and see his mismatched array of feathers that adorned his wings, sections of old, dull, and damaged alongside bright and newly grown. Calypso had gathered as many of them as she could and woven them into her braids, acting as if they were a gift and not something she had scraped out of the dirt where he'd left them. He hated that she wore them, but he knew better than to fight her over it. He had no use for dead feathers anyway. A lot of them had been unsalvageable after Zeus had struck the ship, leaving them burnt and blackened until they came loose. The replacements grew in fine and healthy. That was what mattered. Hermes had said his wings would molt once his life was no longer stressful, and according to Calypso, he had everything he could want here. Physically, he was in good enough health. He had regained the weight lost over those last months on the ship, and the wounds had scabbed over and faded into more scars. But his mind was a mess of tattered strands barely tied together. He woke most nights from nightmares, shed tears so frequently it felt like they had stained his face in the same way he could picture the blood that painted his hands. Sometimes he clouded his own skin until it bled, trying to scrape off the gore that wasn't really there, and the lonely goddess would heal his hands once he had calmed. She never seemed to tire of his self-destructive behavior. She would cry, yell at him, and beg him to just stop clinging to the life he'd had and embrace the paradise he had wound up in. But she never relented her hold over him. To her, he was a gift from the gods, and she would never let him go like he wanted. When he had worn himself out, she would take him to the caves below where her hut was built and bathe him, rubbing his skin with fine oils, trimming his facial hair, and untangling his matted locks until he gave in to his exhaustion and fell asleep. The years at sea had given him gray streaks, and no amount of pampering could remove the scars and calluses he had gained as a warrior. Only his wings remained untainted by his hardships over the years. They had grown strong since he had stopped cutting them off, and his largest set were now as long as his arm. He still stretched them every morning and cleaned them like Hermes had shown him back before they entered the underworld, but only when Calypso was not around to see. She had learned that even so much as running her hands through his feathers would have him lashing out like a terrified animal, and no amount of violence could stop him from thrashing when she tried to care for them. The times she had run her hands over his wings and tried to tidy them had left him hysterical, close to ripping out his own feathers because she had left them feeling so wrong. He would scream until his throat was hoarse and grow sick from the sensation that seemed to linger even after her perfect hands were no longer on them. It took months of the same torturous routine and reaction before she was forced to relent, and he was allowed to care for his own wings without her interference. One less freedom he would have to fight for. More than once she had begged him to show her what to do, wanting to care for the one thing that still seemed to bring him some strength on his endless time in Ogygia. She wanted the honor of being able to caress feathers without him recoiling, to let her preen them like he did so diligently when he was alone. Every time he refused, relished in the small semblance of control it gave him. So while she slept, he would wash and sort them, soothing the edges with the least sweet-smelling oil he could find, and fitting them out until they folded cleanly and dry against his body. It was the one thing she did not have to force him to do. He could starve himself, scratch his own skin until it bled, tear out his hair and scream until he lost his voice, neglecting and punishing his body in all the ways he could think of, but never once did he let harm befall his wings. He'd mistreated them his whole life, and he would never do so again. Having someone else who wasn't Penelope fussing over his wings felt wrong. Next to his wife, Hermes was the most tolerable, and that made sense. The messenger god knew how to clean and care for his wings properly, and after the first few times they'd stopped twitching away from his great-grandfather's hands as they helped him. It had felt nice to have someone else to trust after he lost Polites, and Hermes had clearly loved having someone to teach about all these oddly specific things to do with feathers. He missed Hermes, just like he missed everyone else who he'd once held near his heart. It had been so long, and he'd spent days praying and making sacrifices to his great-grandfather in hopes that they would appear. He didn't know why they didn't. Calypso said her island was hidden from the world, but surely the gods knew of its location since Zeus had allowed him to wash ashore. Odysseus hoped that was the case, that Hermes simply couldn't find or hear him because of the spells. Zeus had stopped his prayers when he was still on the ship. Maybe they had done something to make sure his son wouldn't be able to find their kin. The God King had clearly seen the resemblance, not that it had stopped them from making him suffer more. The other option would likely break whatever was left of his spirit, that he had disgraced them and been abandoned just like Athena had done. Athena. A few days earlier, when a rainstorm had made his restless night even worse, he'd found himself on the same cliff he sat at now, howling his pain and sorrow into the blustering winds, ears filled with the screams of his comrades, of his mother's mournful promises to wait, of his best friend reminding him to be kind to the world. He'd screamed the goddess's name into the heavens, reached out to the sky as if she would come down and pull him free of the paradise he did not want to be in. Calypso had ripped him away from the cliff that night and dragged him back to the hut, crying tears of her own as she screamed and fought and beat her with his flailing wings. She'd locked him inside, woven vines over the doors and windows so he couldn't flee back into the rain, and left him there while she slept in the bath caves. Come morning, she had said nothing, just cleaned away everything he had broken in his agonized state and taken him to get cleaned up. Even though she kept him prisoner here, he still felt bad for lashing out in such a way, but she didn't understand him. She would never let him leave. He wandered up and down the beach so many times he was convinced he knew the place of every seashell and stone. He'd floated out in the waves for so long that her spells now pushed him back to the shore before he could even let his head touch the surface of the water. He'd hacked and clawed and ripped at the plants in the forest until his hands were sticky with sap, but they had all grown back by the day. Nothing he did left a mark on this island. Calypso wouldn't tolerate anything that wasn't perfect. She was convinced that with enough pushing, he would eventually become her perfect husband. Even eating was terrifying, and before every meal he would make her swear that everything she made was not laced with a spell that would change him, in body or mind. She wanted him for all of eternity, and he knew all it took was some ambrosia mixed into his food or drink to do it. The cliff was the closest he could get to an escape from her and the paradise she lived in. All his rafts were dashed against the rocks by her enchanted waves, and every attempt left him trapped inside her hut until he had learned his lesson, as if he were an animal that had not yet learned it belonged. He hadn't built another raft in a long time. His last attempt had left him more shaken than ever. It took a lot to get her truly upset, and his last escape attempt had pushed her beyond that. She threatened to clip his wings if he kept trying to leave, fearing that in time he would forget building the rafts and just try to fly away instead. She didn't know that they were stunted, that they had once been so brittle he could snap them with his own hands and then slice them off with a sharp blade. If he was lucky, he could maybe throw himself off the cliff and try to catch the updrafts, but that would never carry him across the seas. He thought about it plenty of times since he had started spending time on the cliff's edge. He could stand there for hours, letting his wings funnel the sea breeze beneath them and flutter like Hermes' ones would when he flew, but something held him back each time from trying. Fear of failing, fear of falling to his death, or hope that he would still escape paradise without giving up his life. He didn't know which kept him from taking the final step. "Odie," he heard her call from the tree line. "Come back inside and eat. The fruit's especially sweet today." He wanted to snap that the fruit was always sweet. Everything was always grown and ripe in Ojigia, and he hated it. But anger was useless, and it only made her dig in her heels more. So he swallowed his words and stepped back from the cliff's edge, slowly and deliberately, until she was able to get her arms around him. He kept his wings canted away from her roaming hands, face blank as she walked him back to the hut. If he didn't show emotion, if he let her do what she wanted, she would give him back what little space he had sooner. Those fleeting times where she was not glued to his side or watching him with her spells was a pleasure to hold on to. He didn't thank her as she slid a bowl into his hands and did his best not to choke on the sickly sweetness of the food in his mouth. When the time came for him to sleep, he would curl up on the furthest edge of the bed she would allow him to reach, and pretend he did not feel her trying to tug him close so that she could hold him through the night. He'd promised that he would never be drawn to love in paradise, and if that promise killed him, then so be it. Alright, that was chapter 21. This is chapter 22. Someone arrived today. Odysseus had come to learn that the island slept with Calypso. When she was not awake, the flowers died and the plants stopped regrowing when he tore them apart. The waves crashed against the shore in a more natural manner, and the few animals that lived here behaved more like the wild things they were instead of decorations. The spells were still active, still kept him trapped, but those fleeting hours in which he was awake and she was not were almost nice. Ojigia felt like an island instead of a goddess's domain. It was one of those times when he had kept her up late into the night by letting her play with his hair and spinning tales of his time at war that his resilience finally paid off. Before the sun had risen, he had slipped out of his bed and her loose hold, walking barefoot along the forest trails and up towards the cliff. On his way, he tore as many of the plants up as he could, digging his nails into the bark of the trees and peeling it off like a scab until they oozed sap. He threw rocks at the few birds that dared sing in his presence and ripped gashes into the rich soil beneath his feet. He let himself be destructive, taking out the anger on what he could rather than the things he should have, but could not if he wanted to remain in control of his own body. And after the urge to rend had faded away and left him hollow again, he would sit on the cliff and stare listlessly at the horizon until Calypso found him. Today he would never get the chance, because today all the time he had spent crying for help from someone, anyone, was finally rewarded. One heartbeat, he was trudging up through the forest towards the cliff. The next, he was slammed into with such force that he was on his back and winded before he was even aware something had collided with him. "Darling, I can't believe I finally found you. I've been searching. Darling, are you all right? Oh, sorry, dear. I think I came a bit too quickly. Here, let me just..." The weight that had landed on him vanished as quickly as it had arrived, and he felt air gradually filter back into his lungs. Hands grasped him firmly around the shoulders and helped him to sit up, allowing him to take deeper breaths until the black spots in his vision receded. He could already feel tears welling up, and not because his ribs were now bruised. That voice, it couldn't be. He dared look to his left and stared into the shadow that hid the eyes of someone he had waited to see again for years. The two sets of wings on his head fluttered continuously, and a wide, overjoyed smile split what he could see of their face. He could feel their hands still gripping his shoulders, not some phantom sensation he'd dreamt of. They were here. They were actually here. "Hello, old friend. Whoa!" Hermes' greeting was cut off with a yelp as Odysseus practically tackled his great-grandfather into the dirt with his forehead pressed into their shoulder, hugging him as tightly as he could without crushing either of their wings in the process, to which they returned the gesture immediately. They were laughing, an old hiccupy one that didn't sound right coming from a god known for mischief and tricks, and he was crying in their arms. It was rude and disrespectful, and really not how one should act around a god, but he didn't care, because they were here and that meant they hadn't abandoned him. He could feel the wings on his heels fluttering, a steady buzz of feather-light touches against his ankles, and his larger set pulled forward to wrap around the pair of them. Hermes shifted in his grip, twisting until they were able to sit up and hold him as he cried, I'm here. It's all right now, I've got you." He wasn't sure how long he just sat there with the messenger god alternating between bouts of hysterical laughter and sobs as they buried him under white feathers. Whether they were Whatever they were murmuring was lost to his ears. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that Hermes had found him, and he wasn't alone with Calypso anymore. They'd come back just like they'd said they would, even if it had taken years. "Breathe, darling," they ordered softly. "You'll pass out if you keep this up." He tried, by the gods did he try, but it hurt. It felt like there was something constricting around his chest, making him heave with the effort of trying to take in air. Hermes rubbed circles between his shoulder blades, forcing the muscles to relax until he was able to take a full breath without feeling pain. He'd almost stopped crying, but he felt alarmingly lightheaded. When he had finally calmed down, he released the fistful of their cloth that he'd been clutching like a lifeline and sat back, swiping away the tears with the wings behind his ears. He'd grown skilled at moving them now, even if they still moved a lot on their own. "How?" "I've been looking since I heard your prayers," they answered, knowing what he'd wanted to say. "Zeus hid me from you. I didn't know you were in trouble until it was too late. Everything was normal, and then I was flooded with all of your prayers all at once, and I didn't know where, and I'm so sorry, Odysseus. I shouldn't have left at all. Maybe then you would have been all right." "I don't care," he choked out, laying his wings over top of the gods' own and leaning back into their embrace. "You found me. That's all that matters. I thought maybe you were upset with me because of what I did to the crew." "Never! Darling, when I found out what they did, I would have killed them all myself if I'd been there. They hurt you badly. I wouldn't have spared any of them." "I just wanted to get home, and I wanted them to live as well, but it was too much, and they hadn't listened to me, and they were going to—" "No more tears, darling," they ordered softly, fanning his wet eyes with their ear wings. "Just breathe and collect your thoughts for me. You've shed enough tears on this island. I can see the marks staining your face. Forget about them for now, and let's focus on getting you home." Home. It sang in his chest like a broken chord that had just been fixed. Home to his wife and son, whom he had refused to forget. Who had given him the strength to refuse a goddess and all she could offer, for what he truly wanted. I can leave?" he whimpered, daring to be hopeful. "This isn't some trick, is it?" "I wouldn't dare be so cruel," Hermes answered. "After 7 years in which I have scoured the world for you, the gods have decreed your time as a prisoner here to be over. After all the searching I have done, I was finally allowed to find you." 7 years. He'd been trapped here for 7 years. He suddenly felt like crying again. Where's Calypso?" they asked. "I need to tell her that you're free to go." "Asleep," he replied, now too intently focused on making sure he didn't start sobbing into their clothes once more. "She'll know something's wrong when she wakes. Her island's covered in spells meant to track me. She'll feel your presence once the sun has risen." "In that case, she can wait. I already prepared a boat for you and blessed it, and I'll be with you while you sail. For now, let's get you off the ground and find somewhere to wash up." "I'm fine," he rasped. "Let's just go already. I don't want to stay here any longer, knowing I can finally make it past those damn rocks." Hermes made a tutting sound and cupped his hand in their hands, prying it gently away from where he had buried it in their robes. He met the empty void that hid their eyes, and noticed that the comforting smile had been replaced with a small frown. Not upset, just concerned. "Dear, I insist you get cleaned up before you get back out there. And I did just watch you wipe away your own tears with your wings. Please, let me take care of you, just for a little while. I want to make up for everything I missed." It clicked into place rather quickly after that. Hermes felt guilty. They blamed themselves for everything that had happened since the underworld. Had he not left, perhaps they would have found some other way to reach Ithaca, but perhaps things could have turned out worse if the messenger god had been found with them instead of doing his job. It wasn't their fault, not in any way that Odysseus could see. He wanted to say that, and he nearly blurted it out, but he held back, knowing how hard it was to remove the blame from one's shoulders. Hermes's mind would not be changed any time soon. The least he could do was offer them some comfort back, and the god did have a point about washing before he would have to go days without bathing again. He would be off this island soon enough. He could hold on just a bit longer. Let his great-grandfather have his chance to breathe as well. They'd been running themselves ragged looking for him all this time. "All right," he sighed. "There's a cave under the hut. With any luck, Calypso won't wake up for a while." Good thing luck is in my domain then," they giggled, bustling him towards the bathing caves and already seeming happier. I won't leave your side, I promise. In fact, I've just decided I'm not letting you out of my sight until you're back in Ithaca." The pools inside the cave were naturally hot thanks to Calypso's magic, and as soon as he was in the water, Odysseus felt his muscles begin to relax after spending so long hunched in the messenger god's arms. Said god sat with their back to him while he scrubbed himself down of sand and dirt, working on something from behind the cover of their much larger wings. He was only able to see once they declared it to be finished, and he was proudly presented with another pale gray chiton, this time with an open back for his wings, and a new cloak, a dark green chamalis with orange edges, softer than anything he had felt A circular golden pin in the shape of a rooster was sat down with the fabrics on the pool's edge. "Can I clean your hair for you?" they asked, shuffling around so that they could rest his head on their crossed legs. Odysseus took the time to think about it. Calypso never gave him a choice in the matter, doing what she saw fit with his hair against any and all protest. She liked it long, so that she could plait and weave flowers into it, and had removed any blade that he could potentially have used to cut it. His wavy locks had grown so much that they now ended just above the base of his largest wings. He wanted it shorter. So he nodded, pulled himself up so that he was sitting in the shallows of the pool with his head bowed forward. Could you cut it for me?" "Of course, darling," they answered, already beginning to pluck the pink plumeria flowers that the lonely goddess had woven in yesterday. With the god's hands working away at the thick strands and tangles with the comb, Odysseus allowed himself to drift, not enough to fall asleep, but enough that he didn't register Hermes putting the strands to a particularly sharp blade, not until a surprising amount of weight had been removed from his neck. The remaining hair was left at shoulder length and quickly run through with oils to keep the ends from fraying and ruining all of the work that had just been done. "There, do you want me to clean up the mess on your face as well?" Another nod, and Hermes was quick to shave his jaw until it was nearly bare, leaving just enough on his chin that he didn't look boyish, even through all the horrors he'd faced. His face was still mostly unchanged as a result of constant pampering at a goddess's hands. His eyes and the dark circles and tear stains beneath were all he had to show what he had been through. The rest was hidden away under his clothes. And it was only when a wet silk cloth had been pressed to his feathers that he came completely back to his senses. "All these years, and you still squirm when I clean the ones behind your ears," they teased, using one hand beneath his chin to angle his head the way it needed to be. They didn't feel right. Only Penelope's hands on his feathers would ever feel right. But it was familiar, a good kind of familiar. Once he was deemed cleaned, he donned his new clothes and allowed the god to fluff out his other wings and sort through them, Hermes' own sets fluttering happily as he worked, the sound of rustling feathers only broken by delighted humming as they seemed to find Odysseus in a much better state than they'd expected. The responses gave him an embarrassing amount of pride over how well he had taken care of them. Despite everything, he had made sure they stayed all right. The messenger god was also overjoyed to see how much they had grown. "One day," they promised, "we will get you up in the air one day. Once this is all over and you've gotten your rest, I will make sure you get to fly." He had so many questions and so many things he wanted to say. He had been shut out from the rest of the world for so long. He needed to know what had happened to have the gods see fit for him to leave. But he swallowed them all back down and allowed Hermes to rest their own larger wings across his back as the pair left the bathing cave and approached the hut. The sun was rising, and Odysseus could see some of the foliage moving as they got closer, flowers blooming and vines unfurling as Calypso no doubt awoke and sensed the presence of another god. This could get messy, and he shuddered to think of what she could try to do to keep him there. If it had been any other god that had come to tell him the news, he might have been left to fend for himself afterwards. But she couldn't keep him here any longer. Hermes was here. They wouldn't let him be lost again. And that was chapters 21 and 22. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all had a good night or day wherever you are. And I'm actually not going to rant this time because it's it's technically going to be my bedtime in a minute. But so I kind of gotta go, but I will be posting this later than 9:30 because I will still be awake. I just won't be able to film. So I will not be ranting too much tonight. Anyway, I hope you all have a good night or day. Hope you all enjoyed. I already said that. I think that's about it. Bye everyone.